So for anyone that may have joined us after the introduction and the start of the screening, let me introduce again our panelists that have joined us from around the state. Again, my name is David Sommers. I'm a volunteer board member for Ashland.news. I'm a former inaugural publisher of the Royal Valley Times and former publisher of the Long Beach Post and the Long Beach Business Journal. I am just a small part of this incredible team of staff, volunteers, and board members. If you could please join me in giving everyone this tremendous support. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists again for this evening. If you want to know more about them, please look in the program. But in the interest of getting right to the conversation and hopefully looking up everyone's mood after that documentary, let me please welcome again Dr. Regina Lawrence, Associate Dean of the School of Journalism, University of Oregon, Research Director for the Agora Journalism Center. Brian Haas is the Managing Editor of News for Oregon Public Broadcasting. I hope I got that right, Brian. And then our very own, the man himself, the living legend, Bert, the Executive Editor. I want to take a moment to just introduce and thank all the Ashland.news staff, Bert staff that are here. We also have journalists and media leaders from other organizations. I know that there are folks here from Southern Oregon PBS and the Royal Valley Times and JPR. There is an entire ecosystem of local news that requires your support and your interest to make their work work. So it is not just the story of Ashland.news, it's the story of all of us, these journalists, your support, our communities, everyone stay. I want to start this session with some good news. Today, literally today, I didn't fall down, so literally today was the launch of Lookout Eugene. This is started by Lookout Santa Cruz folks who won a Pulitzer Prize 2 years after launch in Santa Cruz for great news coverage. They launched in Eugene, Springfield today, where the Register Guard is down to, I think, 4 or 6 people in its newsroom. The Lookout newsroom team is going to be one of the largest in the state from day one, but it's just one success story. On the east side of the state, Elkhorn Media Group is proving that newspaper deserts are not necessarily news deserts. The Yachats News out on the coast just last week doubled in size by adding a second reporter and rebranding. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. They had to raise $65,000 to fund that position, which is not a small task. But they were able to expand into Lincoln City and cover that community again. There are success stories around the state, and good news is literally happening today. What are good news stories in local journalism around the state or elsewhere that each of you are looking at as a model? Dr. Lynch, you want to start?
Sure. Yes. Thank you very much to have the chance to talk with you all and to do that film together. It was really powerful. At the Agora Journalism Center at the U of O School of Journalism and Communication, we've just released our latest report on Oregon's local news ecosystem. And there are many good stories happening out there. So there is good news. And a couple I'll just quickly mention. From the larger projects like the Oregon Journalism Project, which is an investigative newsroom, doing statewide investigative journalism, to a really interesting, innovative organization called Uplift Local, which is going to focus on multilingual, community-driven, and community-centered journalism for now in the Columbian Gorge. But there's also these smaller outlets. Like I have to give a huge shout out to Ashland.news because look at the community that you are interested in. So I just quickly mentioned that it's some very small, hyper-local outlets like Newsburg in Newburgh that's started by a U of O graduate, actually, and Brandon is doing amazing work. Chaz Hundley is doing amazing work with his small outlets. So I think there is a lot going
on. First, I would say the fact that we just watched a movie about journalism and we're gasping like we're watching a thriller. Like that shows to me that people are extremely interested in journalism in this community. And anytime I get to see members of the public come out and say, I care about journalism, like for me as a journalist, someone who works every day to produce news in this state. It makes me feel like what we're doing matters. And yeah, I mean, I think Regina hit it on the head there. It's just so many new things that are popping up. Oregon Capital Chronicle, like, started recently, and they've done such great work at least supplementing state house coverage for newspapers across the state, including Oregon Public Broadcasting. They provide stories. We share stories with them. So I just see a lot of collaboration that's happening amongst news organizations in Oregon right now, and a real desire to kind of push back on this tide that we saw displayed in the media. And I think that's possible.
Well, Ashland.news, for one, is a definite bright spot. We, going back a little over 3 years, we started working on this in the spring of 2021 at Bert, and launched in January 2022. And we had a few hundred newsletter subscribers at launch, and that is up today is like 5,340 something. So that's a ton. In a town of 22,000, I think our market area, our service area, is the 2 zip codes of talent. And Ashland, we total of like 34,000 residents. So we still have a little room for growth. But when I left the Ashland Daily Tidings, a subscription base, and this was paid subscription, there's trade to the print paper, was in the 1,400 neighborhood. So we're 3 times as big as the Tidings was. But we're doing a like number. I know how many local news stories we're doing Tidings without publishing them. We're doing this. We're doing more with Ashland.news. So I think that's a huge bright spot. Another is the growth nationwide in the nonprofit news model. When Ashland.news joined in, we were was around 200 members, and I think it's 450 now or so. And the end was mentioned briefly in a documentary polluted by, and Sue Cross, the president of that time, she sees the player was president. So that's seeing huge growth. And finally, the growth and collaboration. The old competitive model was great and it keeps you sharp on your toes, but in an era that diminished resources, we need to be efficient and cooperate where we can. And a couple of weeks ago, the Oregonian reached out and to a number of news outlets around the state, and we cooperated on the hands-off rally last Saturday, and that put together a much better report than any one of us could have done individually. So I think that's a great direction that we're heading.
Ecosystem report. I want to ask you a little bit more about that, because you mentioned you just released the 2025 version of that. You really helped map the unfortunate collapse of local news around the state, but also the emerging models of journalism. Tell us a little bit more about what you found in the 2025 update. What surprised you or shifted from the last version, which I think was in 2022?
Yeah, we published the first one in late 2022, and we did that because we wanted to create a baseline as the local news crisis was intensifying across the country. We wanted to understand what was happening here in Oregon, create a baseline so that we could track over time both further diminishment of local news, but also some of the new things that were emerging. In terms of the diminishment and shrinkage of local news, we found that, at least by our count, about 18 local outlets closed or were merged just as late 2022. But of course, as many people know, 3 dozen Oregon newspapers were acquired in a very short period of time by an out-of-state group, Carpenter Media Group. And I think the fact that now 42%, by our count anyway, of Oregon's local news outlets are now owned by out-of-state owners was something to really contend with. And we could talk about that a little more if you're interested. But I think that's something that's radically changed our local news ecosystem, at least potentially, in a very short period of time. And something we're in this report in our own.
So, Ray, let me ask you about that. You covered some really interesting things, from Plentyville to Pink Slime to the sort of AI zombie newspaper that many of you here may be familiar with, his reporting, his newsrooms reporting around sort of what happened remains the Daily Tidings website. You wrote that story about its sort of bizarre online reanimation. For anyone not familiar with that, can you tell us a little bit about what happened and some background? And what I'm really interested in around is the AI generated misinformation around that, what it signals for share this new frontier. Tell us more about that reporting and what you found.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, well, I have to say that Bert was a valuable resource in that reporting because, anytime you're doing journalism, you don't want to be the person who's coming in and say, I know what's going on here without talking to someone who actually lives in the place you're talking about. So, this came across my desk because I had some reporters in OPB's newsroom who said, hey, I saw this website and it looks like they stole my story. Me as the managing editor, part of my job is to, when someone does take your story or takes your image or takes some piece of journalism to produce, my job is to call them and give us or talking to. And so as I started looking into this, I said, okay, let me find out who is doing this. And lo and behold, I fell down the craziest rabbit hole that led me all the way to the United Kingdom to a reporter named Joe Minahan, whose face and name was on hundreds of stories on this website. And he said, I've never heard about Ashland in a very delightful way. And so I was like, okay, there's something bizarre going on here. And what we found was that this website, or whoever was behind this, basically took over a domain that was similar to the Daily Times. And so taking stories from journalists across Oregon, running them through AI, and then publishing them as if there was original reporting that's happening out of Southern Oregon. Right. And I think you had asked, what does this say about AI and the future of journalism? I think, just today, Bert published a story about other websites doing this and stealing journalists' work and pretending that they are living here in these communities and that they're running ads against us and taking dollars out of that. It's not as big of a money venture as All-In Global Capital that we just saw in that film, but it is another threat to journalism. And the hard thing about this industry is there's always bad actors who seem to think like, well, this is an easy way to make money. Nobody's going to defend this. Nobody's going to step up and stop us from taking money from people who are trying to serve their community. And I think that is what is the scariest part about AI.
So, Bert, you are leading a newsroom in Ashland after what's happened with the Daily Tidings Ghost Retread 2.0. Tell us, you've experienced both corporate ownership's death by 1,000 cuts, but you've also, fortunately, been experiencing community-supported renewal firsthand. Tell us about your job now. What's harder today than it was before? How has your definition of success in local journalism changed?
Well, the last part's easy. It really hasn't changed. I mean, the definition of success in local journalism is to serve the community's interests. Give them the hard news when you need to give them the hard news, but also give them the news about things that enrich their life. Be it about sports and arts and entertainment. That's because that can really make a difference in knitting the community together, which is what local journalism does. So it can be literally on the same page. The community can be on the same page in so many ways. The difference between the corporate ownership or the sole proprietor model. I worked for both. I worked as sole owners a couple of times and corporations, a couple of corporations. Sole proprietors can be great. I mean, the Chandler family for many years was wonderful for Los Angeles, but you can also see how their current sole owner is trying to direct the editorial page what to do and the newsroom even more disturbingly. Don't write that story about my friend. Don't do that. You really it's off the journalist and having come down hard with anything. The corporations are good in that you know what they care about. They care about the bottom line, and so they're rational actors to a large degree. And once you've figured out what they're doing, like they did in this documentary, then you can develop your own strategy for how to deal with it. the sole proprietor, the agenda may be hidden, often is, or irrational. So, it's hard to shadow box with that. But now with the nonprofit thing, you have this blessing of working for the community, through a board of directors and in accordance with the mission statement, and that's our boss. The bottom line is that mission statement. So as journalists, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be. Your work is its own reward to an extent, and you don't have to be doing that so that you can make money or please somebody else's ambitions, whatever they be.
So let me expand on the role of local journalism, and it may to us up here seem extraordinarily basic about the importance of local journalism still, but let's talk about that together, Bertie, about why does this still matter? Why is local journalism still important? Why is it so important to the community? So,
Yeah, I think you're so right, especially as they're journalists, which, by the way, I'm not trained as a journalist. I just acknowledge that, but have great respect and admiration for journalism. I think we tend to take for granted that journalism matters. But actually, what we now have is a growing body of academic research that has tried to trace the connections that Bert talked about between access to good quality local news and all kinds of democratic outcomes, things that are good for communities, good for democracy. Everything from, really showing that journalism does really bring about greater governmental accountability, or rather that its absence can lead to less government and corporate accountability, but also the relationship between local news and political polarization, for example. I think that research is super interesting and important. If you think about it, when local news diminishes, where do people turn if they have a news habit? They're more likely then to be drawn into national news. And we know that national news is polarized and more polarizing. So when people pay attention more to national news, they tend to act more and think more like partisans. When they pay more attention to local news, they tend to think and act more like community members. So just as Bert said, local journalism truly is important to knitting together communities.
Brian, you're obviously why is local journalism and statewide journalism still important?
I think the reason it's the most important is people need good information to make decisions in their lives, right? But I'll tell a story to illustrate this. I've been my latest reporting there, work on an investigative podcast called Hush, and our next season is taking place up in Columbia County, which is outside Portland. It's rural, and almost all the newspapers there have closed. There's one reporter, Virginia County. I think she put out some testimony this week saying she makes less than $20 an hour, and she's expected to cover a county, that's vast and is ripe with scandals. I don't know if folks have paid attention to it all in the past year or so, but the St. Helens School District is being rocked by all these child sex abuse scandals. There is money bursting out of the fire department. There's questions about accountability with the police departments there. And what I found talking to people in that community is that they say, I didn't know how much we needed those. I've talked to people who run community Facebook groups that have sort of become the backstop of places where people can find information. And they say, yeah, I run this Facebook group. There's 35,000 people who come here, and I don't sleep because I have to make sure people aren't sending disinformation into this or starting feuds or leading to violence. And, they're like, I'm not a journalist. I don't know how to do this. And they're still trying to fill that information gap, right? The need for information does not go away. Even if journalism goes away, people need information. So I think, and it was said in the documentary, what's important is having people trained who can professionally do this. They can bring sense making to this information and validate information and help people understand what is actually going on. So there's not guessing and there's not people being swayed by political means and things like that. So I think that is the role of journalism in our communities. Bert?
Just to reinforce what Regina said, that there's science says, I guess, and but when reading the newspapers go away, there's less civic engagement. I mean, there's fewer people running for office. There's fewer people voting. And one thing that I was really surprised to see and then thought of, the interest rate on bonds that municipalities issue goes up because people aren't keeping them on their toes or reporting on the meetings where those decisions are made, and they just go, yeah, we'll pay whatever. And so that to me was really surprising. It's very direct effect on that. I'll do a couple of impact things from Ashland.news that wouldn't have happened if we weren't here. Early on, we did a story about I think it's Clark Falls National Forest up on the other side of Mount Ashland. They're going to repave. They said repave that road beyond the ski area. And so we did some reporting on that, and we got a call after one of the stories from a former ranger up there from the 60s. He said, that road has never been paved. And so they ended up, we did another story. We called, we asked, I talked to them about it. Said, they go, oh, well, the road didn't get paved. And so that dirt road that goes onto part of the Fluid Crest Trail at that point, never going to pave the darn thing, which isn't much of a wilderness experience. And if we hadn't been doing that story, who knows, but it might have gone ahead as the original plan. We did a story about a homeless SOU student living by a creek out here along the Greenway, and somebody established a fund that she had to apply for, but she got it so that she would have a roof over her head when she went on to her master's study instead of living out by the creek. And that would have happened if we weren't publishing these stories. We recently did a story, and I just learned earlier this evening that the stories we did about the budget crisis at the Ashland School District, the donor that stepped up and donated $800,000 or so to cover part of the deficit came forward because of the story they read in Ashland. No. So that our reporting is making a difference here, and that's thanks to the KU support.
I love that point about that it costs taxpayers money when we lose open journalism. We saw that repeatedly in Los Angeles. We saw it during the City of Bell scandal, a city, all the gateway cities out in the 710 and 605 corridor, when a city manager in a town of socioeconomically disadvantaged town of 25,000 people is making close to $1 million a year, city manager, it's in large part because there's no journalism covering it anymore. The LA Times eventually won a Pulitzer Prize for it, but this is years after the grip was going on. There are documented examples again and again that when fraud waste and abuse skyrockets, and municipalities pay more basis points to borrow money because of all the settlement costs, and ultimately parks close and libraries close, and it is communities of taxpayers documented again and again we suffer with use of journalism. We mentioned a little bit about Carpenter Media entering the state, their recent acquisitions of VO Media Group and Canberra. Ryan, I know that you've covered that, and Regina, I know that you've spoken about it earlier, and you talked about it in the report. I want to ask about that, about what the reporting suggests that the immediate and long-term impacts this consolidation may have on the state, what kind of concerns that you may have about this consolidation. Is Carpenter the next Alden Media? And I want to ask that with a caveat that it's important to separate out the journalists of Carpenter from the owners of Carpenter, the journalists of Alden from the owners of Alden. There are journalists at these publications still serving this community, still working their butts off, who are not empowered with the decisions that bad corporate ownership are making. So let's focus on that. What concerns can we anticipate with Carpenter coming in and they're gobbling up so many publications around the state?
Well, we don't need to anticipate because almost immediately upon buying these publications from the former Historica Media Group and from the Pamphlet Media Group, they started laying journalism, right? That was one of their first actions. They reported on that, including here at the Rogue Valley Times, at the Bend Bulletin, became Eastern Oregon. I believe one factoid I came across that I was very stunned about. I think it was with the Wallowa County Chieftain and another paper in that group. They basically consolidated it down. So there was 2 reporters who were covering 2 counties, which is 5,000 square miles.
Which is twice the size of New England.
Yes. So, I mean, I hope that Carpenter, they published, like many of these companies do, they say, we're here to help journalists. We wanted to do things in these communities. That's why we bought these papers. We believe in news. I hope that they mean that when they say is how we're put. I don't ever assume what someone's intentions are, but I can look at the actions and see that there are fewer reporters in Oregon because of this acquisition. When it comes to Pamplin Media Group, this was more than 24 newspapers that covered the suburban communities around Portland. These are hundreds of thousands of people in these communities. And these newspapers are being stripped down to as few journalists as possible. So I don't have a lot of hope, but I want them to succeed, and I want them to put more journalists in Oregon.
Yeah, I want to echo something that Ryan said about and we write about this in the report, so much depends right now on how Carpenter decides to run these newspapers that's acquired. And I think a lot of us are just watching to see, are there going to be more cuts? Are there going to be more mergers and closures? But I also want to raise an uncomfortable point, and that is that I think the larger story in all of this is also what the movie tonight helped us think about, which is the underlying economic vulnerability of American for-profit newspapers. It's a very tough business economically. And to me, that's what I would like us to pay a lot of attention to and talk more about. Why is this business model so challenged? What other kinds of models might be more economically viable in the long run? So it's the underlying vulnerability that makes these full-time office family-owned companies decide to make this painful decision to sell to another state-owned.
Here's a line that resonates with me. Nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. Nonprofit is not the solution. You still have to bring in more money than it takes to operate. That's how we say why. What are some of the upgraded basic models? What is the research showing? And in next, I do want to turn to a couple of these excellent questions you got from the audience, but what's extraordinary is there's social benefit corps. There are different statuses. There are different models. There are different ways of making money. There are some that are still heavily reliant on public notices. And these have to be in print publications. It's a business model that's 200 years old. There are some that are making money from the community support for the incredible numbers that Bert shared. What are the models? What are the success stories?
I think we're in a moment of real experimentation. I would flip to one of the book here to find, there was a wonderful quote in the movie about, that's what we have to do right now. Experiment, find the models that work. And I think that's exactly what's happening right now. I'm not sure that we really know collectively, like, here is the one model that's clearly better than all the rest. And part of that is, again, because of the underlying socio-demographics of communities. And so you mentioned Lookout Springfield Eugene, which just launched literally, I think, today, right? But we also know that the owner's model, Dr. Sommers featured indirectly in the film briefly. We know that his model, and he's talked about this, is to choose communities with favorable socioeconomic demographics for a for-profit business. And he also, to his credit, I think he's got an amazing model. There's a lot of community-centered work that he engages in to try to really figure out what are the stories the community cares about. So I'm not trying to denigrate the model, but I am saying that works well for certain communities. Other communities are not going to have the underlying economic basis to support that model.
There's a lot of similarity between Eugene and Santa Cruz and Ashland. These are university towns. These are towns with engaged electorates. There is commonality between these, and that's very much what their model is built on. So these university towns, where there is money and where there is an engaged electorate. A couple of questions from the audience that I want to turn to. This question I love because it just says, "What about PBS and NPR?" And I want to preface that by saying that OVP recently issued a public statement on the threats of federal funding. Talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about what's at stake for OPB and other public media outlets We actually got a couple of questions about that, about the potential of public media capitulating the way that some public universities and private universities have. Certainly was a much bigger story recently, and then there's been seen 100 other crises in the administration since then. But we'll talk about that. Talk about what the threat is for publicly subsidized models like yours. And I'd be really curious about what the research is showing around that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think how I would phrase it is threat is very real. I've been in public media for more than a decade, and this comes up from time to time, and I've never felt it be as real as it is right now. I think there are folks who have wanted to get money out of public media, largely because we are so independent. The argument is always, well, this is government funded. It's got a bias. It's this, that. The reality is we're not beholden to anyone. That's one of the things I love about working at OPB. And that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about Jefferson Public Radio, KLCC in Oregon, is that they don't have owners. They are responsible to the public, right? We at OPB all day talk about how do we deliver news in a way that is meaningful, impactful to our members. We are asking the public, if you believe in what we do, please send us money. If you don't, we still provide the news. And so we only have our reputation. We only have the quality of the news we do in order to get people to support Save as Ashland.news. And I think that's what the threat is, right? There's no levers, there's no capital levers to pull on us. And so they're going and they're trying to do a runaround and federal funding that's already been appropriated to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and use it as a cudgel to shut us up. And, I know that OPB, if this funding went away, we would survive, right? But what I'm actually worried about, it's all the small stations, all the stations in Alaska that depend on this money, that it's 50% of their budget. And they provide the weather reports that keep people safe. So even beyond tax dollars, you're talking about people's lives. OPB provides the emergency alert system for across the entire state of Oregon. When there's wildfires, you're not watching TV, you're not on your phone, the cell system's down, you're on the radio, you listen to the radio, and you're staying safe here. And so that's what's at stake with federal funding. And, I believe that if this threat, becomes going to happen, I think the public will step up because they know what public media provides.
Yeah, anything from your recent report research about the threats of public media. And along with that, I also want to ask, I give you end up on another question around community listening. You've done a lot of research into participatory models that really focus on things like this, of really should it build. And what are you seeing that's happening in public broadcasting? What are you seeing about unique models that really bring in participatory community listening into the models?
Okay. A couple points to your first question about public media. I guess I would just quickly add that it is the research that I've seen that indicates something that was said in the movie as well, which is that public media tend to be among the most trusted media by the public. There's probably a lot of reasons for that, but that's pretty powerful. And also, we know that the United States historically has invested far less than other Western democracies in public media of all forms. So it's always been an underfunded sector, and I think we're seeing the results of that now. In terms of community listening, I guess I would say that I think what's so wonderful about different techniques of community engagement and community-centered journalism is that they can be practiced by every kind of newsroom. Every newsroom in Madison, from listening to community members to figure out what keeps them up at night. What are they curious about? What are they worried about for their kids? Whatever it might be, right? That's the thing that every newsroom can do and, in my opinion, should be doing. So I'll leave that episode.
Bert, I feel free to jump in on any of that, but I do want to share this question that is right throughout. I love this audience question. How can small town journalists deal with the quote, we have to live here too? And what they're asking about is there ever a reluctance to cover controversial stories because you're going to run into somebody at shopping cart, you're going to see somebody at the park, Lord knows it happens to me. It's I would regularly get up when I was with the RPT about why are you covering this or not doing that? People would call it all hours of the day. How has that been going? What are I know you certainly don't shy away from anything, but how's it been for you journalists?
I'm so used to that. I started doing this in 1982, and that was in a town that's under 6,000 times, but and a couple weekly of the town the same size, and then Ashland is a big city for people like 12,000. But I'm used to the idea that they're going to see the person you write about in your grocery line, and the only way that people ever deal with it is to just play it straight, and they don't have to worry about remembering what you told or what we held out or should have done, or just play straight and straight ahead and let the chips fall to the net. And that's how you get stigmatized. If I didn't do anything else, you're asking for trouble. People want the bad news. If there's bad news out there, maybe they thank you for it. If there's something hard to read, and we publish some stories that are just really disturbing, and you wish you didn't have to print. But if the community needs to know about it, they'll thank you for it. That's sometimes they'll like, "Oh, thank you. What after the best?" And yeah, to answer that question. Back and we talk about the business model thing a little bit. I wrote down one thing off of that thing, and I think involves an economic turn of art, because it says journalism is a social good, and that the social good thing is something that we try and figure out how to deliver. In this country, we're still trying to figure out how to deliver healthcare to somebody. Thank you that national defense or firefighting, clean water and air. We also need, as a people, clean information. We need local information to go about our business and make informed decisions and live the fullest best life we can. But we have to figure out how to pay for that. I mean, for so long, it was subsidized through the retail capitalistic advertising model, which was great. That worked for a while, but now not so much. It's sort of the nonprofit thing, and like David says, it's not a business model. It's a kind of a vehicle, vessel. It needs some dynamism with it. The Lookout papers are structured slightly differently. They're a public benefit corporation, so they're allowed to make, like Blue Cross says, they're allowed to make a profit, but they're doing public good. They're not no tax expert, so I can't tell you more about that. But I can say that the capitalistic model is dead. I mean, it's been ultra fit, and going back to Carpenter, that real estate piece they're selling the Astoria property. So exactly like it said in the movie, nice newspaper office right downtown. That real estate's gone. That's no longer the newspaper office. That's going into the profit margin of Carpenter Media. Go ahead.
Tied to that working quickly to everything that Bert just laid out, and that the movie gave us a wonderful history of sort of the decline of that business model. The other piece that the film didn't touch on, I think, very much is the way that the big platforms, especially like Google, for example, are now sucking up the majority by far of advertising dollars that are available out there for the media, and also in many ways profiting off the content of local news outlets that produce content that people search for, but the platforms don't pay for it. So I think that's sort of like a final layer of this extremely difficult business model.
So let me actually ask you about that. And we are almost at time, but I do want to continue the conversation for another month or two, because I think that this is important around what's happening legislatively this year. There are 4 bills in the Oregon legislature having to do with supporting local journalism. That's extraordinary in a legislature structured as this. That the interest from the legislature is this supportive at this moment in time. We are keeping a close watch on this. You mentioned sort of what big tech has done. The national estimates are somewhere around what was $21 billion a year taken out of local news that used to help support these newsrooms. You've all been watching what's happening with legislation this year. Talk a little bit about that. Talk about how there may be some legislative fixes and what's happening this year.
I guess the one I could comment on the best, the one I've been following most closely, is SB 686, which there was just a hearing on it yesterday. And without getting into too much detail, it's a little complicated, but it's designed to try to, it's a regulatory measure that's designed to make the platforms pay for that content that they are leveraging, but never paying for themselves. So the structure would be basically a way to allow every user in Oregon to receive some kind of payment benefit back for that content. And the important thing about that bill that I think really is noteworthy is that the majority of those resources that would then have to be invested in hiring local journalists. And that's so critical because that's really the key to everything we really saw tonight.
Yeah, I mean, SB 686 is, these are kind of early attempts to get some of these giant platforms to put something into journalism. They do, Google in particular does put some money into journalism. They provide grants to some media outlets, but it is a fraction of the value that they're getting from local news. As it said in the movie, news is an ecosystem and it starts with local news, right? National outlets like the New York Times don't know about stories that are happening in Oregon, in Washington, in Idaho until local news reports on it. And so, whether this works or not, I don't know. It's a gamble. It's a gamble, but I think journalism is in such a desperate state that we're willing to take some gambles on taking on these big companies that have more money than God, and seeing if we can get just a few crumbs. Can we just have, hire 30 reporters? That would be great, and make our state better. So, yeah.
And that bill there's been an evolution around it. Positively, my opinion is making sure that there are some mechanisms to keep the funding in the state, in community positions, not to go to offshore page designers or copy editors on the other side of the country. And I think that an important part of that, where the university comes into play, is that there is what's called a headcount formula that basically, you employ X number of journalists, but probably the most important part of it is the mechanism that would route some of the funding through a consortium of the university to support these small, local, independent news organizations. Bert, I really appreciate you letting me help out with the legislation with Ashland.news this year, and we have some fun with that, so thank you. I do want to ask one really important question before we get to the last question, and I think that this question is just AI, ... I've seen artificial intelligence be a very powerful tool in the long newsroom for data analysis of feeding millions of data points into it to get a model of practices in policing, but I've also seen the worst of it. It's an open-ended question, but what are you afraid of and what are you hopeful of around AI and legislative outcome? Would you go first?
It's a power so great it can only be used for good or evil. It comes from what? It depends. The data analysis thing, and I've been hearing about the AI in newsrooms for 20 plus years, and in the breaking news thing, it's like you get there's an earthquake somewhere, and you write the same story. It was early estimates of this magnitude, and it was this many miles west of whatever, so they estimated this. AI can do that. But AI can do it's great with the stock market. It's good with baseball box scores because this is data you can feed in and if you compile some sort of report. Now, the troubling thing is that it makes mistakes. And so he said, well, here's a bowl of popcorn. 99% of that popcorn is great, but one of them's going to break your tooth. So, enjoy your popcorn. I feel like that as a news consumer when I hear AI is in the mix. So I don't want the AI in our apps events forward. So, yep.
I think, yes, it is a tool, right? And I use AI every day to transcribe it. It saves me hours and hours and hours of time that I can spend doing actual meaningful things. But yes, until this issue of factual accuracy gets worked out, I think it's pretty hard to say this is going to have a big impact on journalism because our jobs are facts, right? Like, I've tried to use so many of these tools of like, hey, I'm going to dump all these 500-page reports in and try and help summarize this. And it turns out, well, there's like 8 things wrong in what you told me about this, or things that are inaccurate, or summarize this publicly. Well, AI doesn't understand the context between a joke and, actual things being said in a meeting that matter. And so until those issues get resolved, I don't know what role it plays in journalism. I think possibly there are ways it could help make it more efficient. I would love an AI tool that I could just say, file this public records request for me, and would save me that time and dealing with records clerks. But until that exists, I'll just keep chipping away.
But I'll just give a quick example. I got a call a couple of weeks ago when the strike was going on, the Providence strike, the nurses strike. I got a call, you need to correct your story. And well, first he said, this is Ashland.news. He said, no, it's Ashland.news. He said, oh, you need to correct your story, and blah, blah, blah. And Metro did not read the timing of this. They voted different than the other units for one reason or the other. And so there was a nuance there. And there's one important unit that earlier done this very clearly. And so there was a nuance, and Brink was did it. And so I went and looked at our stories back here to complete, and I said, look, he said Ashland. I think it's a so I went and looked at that site, and their AI had screwed it up. They had thought that nuance had been that way they done it. They screwed it up in the correction as due to the AI.
Yeah, I think it's so important to just remember one basic thing, and that is that AI doesn't know anything. It doesn't know anything. It just can analyze patterns at a very sophisticated level.
And for the students that are here tonight, I think one of the most important lessons is how you critically think about the mass media. It's not just enough to consume it, but to actually take the time to know who's producing it. I want to, again, sort of where we began, I want to talk about hope. We talked about some good news around local journalism, but you each had profound answers about what you see as bright spots. So I want to end on that. Is what gives you hope around local journalism, around the state, around the nation? What fires you up to keep going when you see things like this documentary, and you see so many stories, when you see the negative data and the positive data? What's the hopeful moment for you?
Okay, sure. I think what gives me hope is, one, watching that documentary. I was like, great, I want to go do some journalism. Like, seeing stuff like that just makes me fired up. Like, yeah, let's go find out what people are trying to hide. I think, I know there are students here. Every time I talk to a young person who's interested in journalism or, just understanding the media, they're so to it, right? Like, people still care. I think journalism isn't going to go away because people are not going to stop caring about it. There's so many people here. This is amazing. So every day I see that people do care about journalism. There are people who maybe think nobody does, or all we care about is scrolling Instagram, but it's just not the case in my research. You talk to people, they want information, they want information, and they believe in what journalism can do for a society.
What gives me hope is, well, the intrinsic value of journalism. And every day we see this with a report where it pays off to go find out stuff and share it with other people. I mean, it just works. That's the way things are structured to have the actually telling stories. Another thing is that the budding sense of cooperation, and there's not just the aforementioned thing, but other sharing things like the Agora Journalism project that Regina mentioned earlier, that initiative with involving the Oregonian, which is great that they would do that because they are a legacy outfit, and for them to kind of pivot to that is a watershed, I think. And that the Agora Journalism Center at the University of Oregon is doing some great things in finding out what's going on around the state and sharing the Fund for Oregon Rural Journalism was also, they haven't come up tonight, but they're doing good work. But on the immediate fund, what gives me hope is all of you being here tonight. Thank you for that. And this journey out to find out your interest and curiosity and what's going on with journalism and what's going on in Ashland just gives me thank you.
We're going to try to top that. But I guess one thing I would add, and I wonder maybe Eric and Andrew, your people, so you may be seeing this as well, but there's an uptick in interest among young people and people further along in their careers to get into media, to get into journalism, to get into storytelling. And if there's any bright spot with the extremely challenging political and social moment that we're in right now, it could be that, just like we saw in the film, when we see people being taken advantage of, when we see hypocrisy, when we see information being withheld that is affecting the public, that sparks that urge, that instinct, right, to find out the real information, to publish the real information, to help the public know what's going on. So I definitely think that's happening right now in their society.
I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Regina Lawrence from the University of Oregon. Brink Ecosystem Reported is a fascinating story of success and challenges and insights. Ryan Haas with Oregon Public Broadcasting, OPB, and Bert from Ashland.news. To each of you, thank you for your support. Get to know these organizations, support the GPI, support study subscribe to all of these organizations that are doing local news in our communities around the state. Thank you for your support. Thank you to our families. Thank you to the Ashland State. Have a good night.